"I needn't touch you to enjoy you," the governor had told her. As the carriage approached Gallifet Mansion, his words rang through Marie-Jeanne's head like a rattlesnake. She was sick of his vulgar torment and unsure of how much more she could stand. When the clacking hooves slowed down outside, she felt a sinking feeling in her gut. Before leaving her carriage and facing the world, she desperately needed a moment to herself, so she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered her peace on the veranda that morning. The terrace by the governor's bedchamber overlooked the stunning seafront, and after daybreak the tropical sun had burned brighter than ever. As a southerner, it had taken Marie-Jeanne a while to feel comfortable in the Northern Cape, but of late she'd finally started to feel at home in the vibrant city. As usual, the coastal town had hummed softly with its bustling markets and chiming church bells, and she smiled while taking in the view, soaking up the lively atmosphere. Founded on a sprawling bay, CAP-FRANÇAIS was sometimes dubbed Little Paris for its eclectic culture and modern architecture, albeit its baking climate was a far cry from Parisian weather. The city was the first port of call for the infinite ships peppering its harbour, and the place was an alluring haven for all kinds of merchants, sailors, artists, lawmakers, swindlers and brothel keepers. With its own prisons, hospitals, theatres and museums, the impressive Cape Town and its 20,000 inhabitants were an exciting spectacle for any foreign visitor. Marie-Jeanne could see it all from the veranda, however her gaze was always drawn to the gorgeous ocean horizon. She was only 15, but her peers often raved about her swift ripening into a dazzling beauty, yet despite the flattery, Marie-Jeanne carried herself like an ugly duckling. Her hazel eyes were always pointed low, and she regularly made herself smaller by hunching her shoulders forward. Also, she despised her pale bronze skin and her smooth auburn locks, for both features reminded her that she was neither black nor white, but something curious in between. Governor Philibert Blanchelande had branded Marie-Jeanne his little maîtresse en titre, as though he was some delusional king authorized to bestow such ridiculous titles. Predictably, it was Philibert's bellowing voice that ruined her peace that morning, but prior to his boorish intrusion she'd felt like she was in a warm fuzzy dream. As her gauzy lilac gown had fluttered in the summer breeze, 3 butterflies had landed on her hand, and while leaning gently against the balcony railing, she'd studied the insects carefully. One was the colour of coal, another lily white, and the last a lucent yellow. Their delicate wings had borne patterns prettier than Marie-Jeanne had ever seen before, and they'd rested on her palm magnetically, as though drawn to her aura. Alas, the peaceful moment hadn't lasted. It never did. In a jiffy, the butterflies had disappeared into the distance, and a blonde servant had yanked Marie-Jeanne into the bedchamber. As normal, the old pot-bellied governor had been slumped on his bed in his powdered wig, fondling 2 pretty black women at his side. This time the ladies had been dangling grapes into Philibert's mouth, lest he strain a muscle feeding himself. When he spotted Marie-Jeanne, his small, slimy eyes crawled across her figure, and he had said, "So sweet and innocent, but a body to die for. Show these harlots what they're competing with." Marie-Jeanne had resisted his lustful advances on many occasions, and she was determined to preserve her chastity as long as possible. Sometimes she felt as though she'd rather die than allow the governor to take her, yet fortunately his perverse reverence of her ofttimes discouraged him from overstepping the line, but he always found other ways to violate her. "Don't touch me," she had barked as the blonde woman tugged at her gown. However, the servant persisted, and Marie-Jeanne had been forced to conceal herself using her bare hands. If the girl doesn't want to be touched, then she doesn't want to be touched. Philibert's smirk had been cold and smug, his tone sarcastic and bitter. "I needn't touch you to enjoy you." Holding back her tears fiercely, Marie-Jeanne had felt utterly powerless as he leered at her flesh. Ogling Marie-Jeanne while prostitutes pleasured him was Philibert's vile way of stealing her innocence without touching her. It was heinous and humiliating, yet she refused to cry. She was tougher than that. The governor might own her body, but no one owned her soul. Luckily, the ride to Galifet had offered her some respite from the repulsive predator. Marie-Jeanne hadn't wanted to join the voyage, but she wasn't given a choice. Philibert had cajoled all of his bigwig chums into attending the trip, and unfortunately she'd failed to escape the pompous pilgrimage. Following Vincent Auger's botched revolt, the fat old man was more paranoid than ever, so lately he kept an extra close eye on her and every other person of colour in his circle. She was amused by how flustered and excited the bigwigs had become about the hot air balloon. Beyond the brothels, nothing seemed to arouse white men more than science could. Marie-Jeanne had voiced the thought to her best friend Kat during the bumpy journey, and Kat had chuckled at the jibe, but she'd cautioned Marie-Jeanne straight after. Ridiculing white men was no laughing matter. Many people of colour had been lynched for less. Upon exiting the horse-drawn carriage, Kat was astounded by the size of their temporary home, but Marie-Jeanne wasn't too bothered. Nothing built on the profits of slavery would ever impress the disillusioned teen, but she sized up the place all the same. Befitting the vast wealth of its absentee owner hidden away in Paris, Galifet Mansion was an absurdly lavish edifice. Its white finish aptly repelled the scorching sunlight, blinding anyone who gazed at it too long, and the enormous courtyard was adorned with hundreds of colourful flowers, a cluster of ugly stone busts, a pink magnolia tree, and a neat web of winding pathways. The structure was known to have survived hurricanes, earthquakes, and above all, raucous and decadent soirees. Standing firm amid the thick greenery and tall groves of its rural surroundings, the building was a baroque fortress for the slavers of Saint-Domingue. Meanwhile, under its imposing shadow, meandering field hands dampened the soil with their sweat, forbidden from ever stepping foot inside the colonial chateau. Marie-Jeanne watched the black bodies roam past her, barely raising their weary heads to heed the new visitors. She felt guilty as she peered at them, suddenly reminded that her own dismal circumstances were relative. Her darker-skinned kin had it far worse in the cane fields. As the white aristocrats began to pour out of their fancy carriages, they all buzzed with enthusiasm. Marie-Jeanne watched on blankly as the governor and his greasy deputy, Donati and Rochambeau, dismounted their mares with the aid of their lackeys. Laurent Lenoir descended his own horse shortly after, and she sensed that his steed liked him. Yet she wasn't surprised. People of colour had a way with horses that white folk didn't, and some of them even believed horse thievery to be the most shameful of all crimes. Laurent's burly white beast crouched slightly to help him dismount, and she could see that they had a strong relationship. In truth, she was a little jealous. She had never ridden a horse before, and even if she'd had a penny to her name, they were far too expensive. A fancy mount might cost 1,500 livres. She always dreamed of riding a roan mare that matched her auburn hair, but for now, that's all it was, a dream. Next, she spotted the Black Marquis's wife, Angèle de Rouvray. Angèle often made Marie-Jeanne nervous. The fearsome Frenchwoman always seemed to be scowling at something, and Marie-Jeanne pitied her children, Pauline and Edouard. They both shared Marie-Jeanne's bronze complexion, and she wondered if they'd suffer a similar identity crisis to her own as they came of age. Ahead of the mansion, a small cohort patiently awaited the governor's greeting, and Philibert marched straight towards them. Marie-Jeanne trailed behind him shyly like an unwanted pet, and she recognized a few faces amid the welcome party. Arnaud Luc was an elderly administrator and the top dog at the Galifet plantations. He was also one of the colony's balloon-making pioneers, raring to unveil his new airborne toy. Beside Odeluc was his second-in-command, Pierre Mossu, an ugly man with skin as pink as a flamingo and a blotchy face. Mossu was a local plantation manager, and as he grimaced in the torrid heat, he appeared aloof to the new arrivals. Behind Odeluc and Mossu, there stood a grey-haired priest and several housemaids of colour with their heads bowed submissively. A couple of the maids took Marie-Jeanne by surprise when they smiled at her. She smiled back at them bashfully, grateful to be noticed by the warm strangers. Marie-Jeanne and Kat snickered quietly when Philibert strode right past Odeluc. The old administrator had held out his wrinkly palm for the governor, but embarrassingly, the handshake had been snubbed. With a spring in his step, Philibert Blanchelande had pranced straight towards Félicité Bonheur and her goddaughter, Louise. They were both dark and beautiful. Marie-Jeanne had spoken to them at the market once or twice, but she didn't know them very well. Perhaps she'd try and befriend them during the stay. By the speed he transformed into a courteous gentleman, it was obvious that the governor had a strong affection for Félicité. "Madame Bonheur," he said, kissing her hand, "what an immense pleasure it is to see you here." "Bonjour, Governor Blanchelande," Félicité replied. "It's been a while." "Too long, my dear Félicité. None of the coloured women in Le Cap are as splendid as you are, madam. But who's looking after the marvellous hotel? Rest assured, the Couronne's in good hands, despite our brief absence, Governor." I tried to convince Louise to stay behind, but she insisted on accompanying Sanité and I. All month, my goddaughters have been hounding me about Audiobook's magic balloon. "They share my excitement then," Philibert chirped, turning to Louise. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. But my dear Louise, it's not magic. It's just science." Félicité and Philibert traded a few more niceties before the governor arrived at his burning query. Félicité told him that he would find Zamba at the Croix Bossal cemetery near Le Gosset. Then the governor kissed her hand once more and stomped off right away. Marie-Jeanne didn't know much about the mysterious maroon priest they called Boukman, but she'd always hoped to meet him someday. Before following Kat and the entourage into the mansion, Marie-Jeanne overheard Louise ask her godmother a peculiar question. "Where's the lady man?" she muttered. Marie-Jeanne was no fan of derogatory labels. She had received plenty of them already during her short life. Mulatta, mulatto, mulatress, half-breed, mongrel, negress, quadroon. She could fill an encyclopedia with every racial slur she'd heard in Saint-Domingue. In fact, there were rumours that the colony's pernickety intendant was already compiling one. Nonetheless, ladyman was a particularly odd term. She knew exactly who Louise was talking about, yet something about the phrase seemed drastically inappropriate. Wearing extravagant frocks and copious amounts of makeup did not render someone a lady, Marie-Jeanne thought. Everyone in CAP-FRANÇAIS, including Marie-Jeanne, had been excited about the arrival of the cross-dressing coffee planter. She always enjoyed meeting fellow Southerners, but earlier that day, when she saw him flirting with a pair of floozies by the harbour, she'd been totally underwhelmed. As he had attempted to woo the local girls, Romaine Rivière had appeared nothing other than an ordinary man. At first glance, Marie-Jeanne thought he looked more of a womanizer than a woman.